You were never really one of us." My father-in-law said it in a voice loud enough to carry across the entire reception hall, and for one suspended second, even the string quartet stopped playing. 200 guests turned toward me. The champagne flutes froze halfway to lips. Somewhere near the dessert table, a waiter dropped a spoon, and the clatter of it against the marble floor was the only sound in the room. It was supposed to be the happiest night of my life. My 20th wedding anniversary, the party my husband's family had insisted on throwing at the Brennan estate. All white roses and crystal and a tenth the size of a small church set up on the back lawn. I had spent the afternoon getting my hair done, slipping into a navy gown I'd saved for 3 months to afford, practicing how I'd thank everyone for coming. I had not practiced for this. My father-in-law, Gideon, stood at the head of the long table with a microphone in one hand and a glass of bourbon in the other. He had asked for everyone's attention to say a few words, and I had smiled, expecting one of his stiff little toasts about family and legacy. Instead, he looked straight at me and said it again, slower this time, so no one could pretend they'd misheard. "You married into this family, but you were never really one of us. And tonight I'm done pretending otherwise. I want you to understand who I am before I tell you what I did next, because the version of me that walked into that party would never have done it. My name is Theresa Moreland. I'm 43 years old. I grew up in a rented duplex outside Toledo with a mother who cleaned offices at night and a father who left when I was 6. I put myself through nursing school, working doubles at a diner, and I have spent the last 20 years as a labor and delivery nurse, holding strangers' hands through the worst and best hours of their lives. I am not a dramatic person. I have never raised my voice in public. The loudest thing I'd ever done was cry quietly in a hospital supply closet after losing a patient. So when Gideon Brennan stood up and tried to erase me in front of everyone I knew, the room expected me to fall apart. My husband expected it. I could see Patrick frozen in his seat, 3 chairs down, his face the color of the tablecloth, his mouth opening and closing without a single word coming out. My mother-in-law had her hand pressed flat against her chest. My sister-in-law was already pulling out her phone, and I knew the way you know a storm is coming from the smell of the air, that this was going to be a video. The whole thing. Forwarded around their country club by Sunday. And here's the strange part. I didn't cry. I didn't run. I felt something settle in me instead, cold and clear. Like the moment in a delivery room when everything goes sideways and you stop being scared because there's simply no time for it anymore. I reached down to the small clutch in my lap, the one I'd almost left at home, and I felt the edge of the folder I'd tucked inside it that morning. The folder I'd been carrying around for 11 days, waiting, hoping I'd never have to use it. I stood up. "You know what, Gideon?" I said, and I was surprised at how steady my voice came out. "You're absolutely right. I was never one of you, and after tonight, I think I'm going to consider that the luckiest thing that ever happened to me." Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the years that came before it. I met Patrick Brennan at a hospital fundraiser when I was 22. He was the youngest son of the Brennan family, old Cleveland money, the kind that came from steel 100 years ago and real estate ever since. I didn't know any of that when I met him. He told me he worked in the family business and asked if I wanted to split a plate of those tiny crab cakes nobody else was eating, and I thought he was funny and a little shy and that he had kind eyes. We were married 18 months later in a courthouse because by then I'd met his family and understood that a real wedding would have been a battlefield. The Brennans never approved of me. To them, I was the nurse from Toledo who'd trapped their son. Never mind that Patrick had pursued me for a year before I agreed to a second date. Gideon, his father, was the worst of them. He had a way of looking at me like I was a stain someone had forgotten to clean up. At every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every excruciating Sunday dinner at the estate, he found small ways to remind me where I came from. He'd ask if the wine was too sophisticated for my palate. He'd mention how the family had standards. Once, early on, he slid an envelope across the table toward me and offered me $40,000 to divorce his son and go back to whatever you came from. I left it sitting there and never told Patrick. I should have. That was my first mistake. The one I made over and over for 20 years. Protecting Patrick from the truth of his own father because I thought I was protecting our marriage. But I loved Patrick, and for a long time that was enough. We had 2 children, Olivia and Sam, and we built a life that had nothing to do with the Brennan money. Patrick had broken away from the family business in his 30s and started his own contracting company. We weren't rich. We had a 4-bedroom in a nice but not fancy suburb, 2 car payments, a leaky roof we kept meaning to fix. I kept working at the hospital because I loved it, and because I'd learned a long time ago never to depend entirely on anyone else's money for my survival. The thing that should have warned me came 3 years ago when Patrick's mother got sick. Margaret Brennan was the only one in that family who'd ever been halfway kind to me. She wasn't warm exactly, but she'd defended me a few times. And when our daughter was born, she'd come to the hospital and held Olivia and cried. And for a moment, I thought maybe there was a real person under all that ice. When she was diagnosed, it was Patrick and I who drove her to her chemo appointments. Not Gideon. He was always too busy. Off at the office or the club. It was me who sat with Margaret through 6 hours of infusions. Me who learned to manage her nausea. Me who held the basin and rubbed her back and told her the stories about the hospital that made her laugh when nothing else could. In her last month, when she could barely speak, she gripped my hand one afternoon while Patrick was getting coffee, and she said something I didn't understand at the time. She said, "There's a box in my closet behind the winter coats. When the time comes, it's yours, not theirs, yours." I thought it was the medication talking. I told her to rest. She died 11 days later, and in the chaos of the funeral, I forgot about it completely. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. And to understand why, you have to understand what happened to the family after Margaret was gone. Gideon changed. With Margaret gone, there was no one left to even pretend to soften him, and he got worse, colder, crueler, more obsessed with the family name and the family money than ever. He started talking constantly about legacy and bloodlines, about who deserved what and who didn't. He'd had 4 children, Patrick, my husband, his older brother Russell, who ran the family business and was as arrogant as Gideon himself, a sister, Diana, who'd married a surgeon and rarely came around, and the youngest, a son named Theo, who was the golden child, the one Gideon had always favored. About a year after Margaret died, Gideon announced he was redoing his estate plan. He gathered the whole family for a dinner, and pointedly, he did not include the spouses. Just his children. Patrick came home from that dinner pale and quiet and wouldn't tell me what was said. I knew it was bad. I knew because that was the night he started drinking more, and the night he stopped looking me in the eye when I asked if we were okay. It took me 2 months to get it out of him. We were lying in bed one night, and I just asked, plainly, what his father had done. And Patrick, my steady, gentle Patrick, started to cry. He told me Gideon had restructured everything. The family trust, the business shares, the estate, and that he'd written specific conditions into it. The Brennan wealth would only pass to heirs who were of the blood and of the family. Patrick's children, Olivia and Sam, were named. But there was a clause that said any heir whose household was diluted by marriage outside the family's values could be excluded at the trustee's discretion. The trustee was Gideon. And then, after him, Theo. It was aimed at me. Patrick knew it. I knew it. Gideon had built a machine to disinherit my children's father, to punish Patrick for the unforgivable crime of marrying me. And he'd done it with the cold legal precision of a man who'd spent his whole life learning how to use money as a weapon. I was furious. Not for myself, I'd never wanted a dime of Brennan money. I was furious for my children, who Gideon was willing to use as bargaining chips. But Patrick begged me to let it go. "He's an old man," he said. "Let's just keep our heads down. Maybe he'll change his mind." So I did. Again, I swallowed it. I kept showing up to the Sunday dinners. I kept being polite. And I told myself that someday it wouldn't matter. Then, 2 weeks before our anniversary party, two things happened in the same 48 hours. The first was that I was helping Patrick's sister Diana clear out the last of Margaret's belongings, which had sat untouched in a guest room of the estate for 3 years because Gideon couldn't bring himself to deal with them. Diana didn't want to do it alone, and to my surprise, she asked me. We were in the closet, pulling down old coats, when my hand brushed against something hard and rectangular at the very back of the shelf. A box, behind the winter coats. I went completely still. Margaret's voice came back to me across 3 years, so clear it was like she was standing in the room. "It's yours. Not theirs. Yours." I don't know why I didn't tell Diana. Instinct, maybe. Or 20 years of learning that nothing good came of trusting the Brennans. I slipped the box into my tote bag while she was carrying a load of coats downstairs, and I took it home. And that night, after Patrick was asleep, I opened it in the bathroom with the door locked like a teenager. Inside were documents. Margaret had been meticulous. There were bank statements, photocopies of checks, letters, and a leather notebook filled with her small, careful handwriting. And as I sat on the cold bathroom tile reading it, page by page, the entire story of the Brennan family rearranged itself in my mind. Gideon Brennan was not the patriarch he pretended to be. For almost 15 years, he had been quietly draining the family trust, the same trust he claimed to be protecting for his precious bloodline. He'd been moving money into a separate account, one that wasn't part of the family holdings at all, one that Margaret had discovered by accident years earlier. He'd been funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars to a woman named Celeste, a woman he'd kept in a condo across town for the better part of 2 decades. There were photographs, there were hotel records, there was a birth certificate. Gideon had a 5th child, a daughter now 26 years old, whom no one in the family knew existed. He'd been supporting her and her mother with money he was stealing from the very trust he'd just rewritten to exclude my children on the grounds of family values. Margaret had known. That was the part that broke my heart. She'd known for over a decade, and she'd stayed, and she'd documented every bit of it, building this quiet, careful case in the dark while she smiled across the dinner table. In the notebook, in an entry dated just weeks before she died, she'd written, "I haven't the strength to use this, but someone will. Someone with more courage than I had. I am leaving it for the one person in this family who has never once lied to me." She'd meant me. The second thing that happened was smaller, but it lit the fuse. 3 days before the party, my daughter Olivia, who was 17, came home from a visit to the estate in tears. Gideon had cornered her in the kitchen and told her that she'd never amount to much, coming from her mother's side. My quiet, sweet girl who'd done nothing but exist, reduced to crying in her car in our driveway because a bitter old man needed someone smaller than himself to wound. That was the moment something in me closed like a door. I made copies of everything. I took the originals to an attorney. Not the family's attorney. A stranger I found myself. A sharp woman downtown who looked through Margaret's box and went very quiet and then asked me what I wanted to do. I told her I needed her to verify it was real and legally sound. She called me 2 days later and said it was airtight. Margaret had even had several of the key documents notarized. I put a single folder in my clutch the morning of the party. Just the highlights, the condo lease, one photograph, the birth certificate, and a single page from the trust account showing the years of withdrawals. I didn't know if I'd use it. I told myself I was just carrying it for courage. But I think, somewhere underneath, I already knew. So now you understand why, when Gideon Brennan stood up at my anniversary party and told 200 people that I was never one of them, I didn't cry. I stood there, in my navy dress, and I let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. And then I walked, slowly, deliberately, toward the head of the table where Gideon stood with his microphone and his bourbon, and his hateful, satisfied smile. "You're right," I said again, and I held my hand out. "May I?" He was so confident, so used to me folding, that he actually handed me the microphone. I think he expected a tearful little goodbye. A surrender. "For 20 years, I said, and my voice filled the tent. "This family has reminded me that I don't belong, that I'm not of the blood, that I don't share your values." I looked at Gideon, and tonight I finally agree, because I would never, ever want to share the values of a man who spent the last 15 years stealing from his own family to pay for a secret he kept from his dying wife. The smile slid off Gideon's face. I opened the folder. I didn't read from it. I memorized the parts that mattered. "There's a condo on Edgewater Drive," I said. "Gideon's been paying for it since before some of you in this room were born. And the woman who lives there, Celeste, has a daughter, Gideon's daughter, 26 years old, the youngest Brennan child, except none of you knew she existed. You could have heard a pin drop on grass. Russell, the older brother, was on his feet. Theo had gone white, and Gideon was making a sound, a kind of strangled denial, reaching for the microphone, but I stepped back out of his reach. "He paid for all of it," I went on, "with money he took from the family trust, the same trust he just rewrote to disinherit his own grandchildren because their mother isn't good enough. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, over 15 years. I have the account statements. I have the lease. I have the birth certificate." I held up the photograph for just a second, long enough for the front tables to see, and then closed the folder. "Margaret knew," I said, quieter now, and the quiet was worse than shouting. "Your wife knew for years, Gideon. She wrote it all down. And do you know who she trusted to tell the truth when she couldn't? Not her sons, not her precious bloodline. The nurse from Toledo, the one who held her hand through chemo while you were at the club." Gideon's legs seemed to go out from under him. He grabbed the back of a chair and sat down hard. The bourbon glass tipped over and spread across the white tablecloth like something bleeding. I set the microphone down gently on the table next to him. "I came here tonight to thank everyone for 20 years of pretending to like me," I said to the room now, to all of them. "But Gideon's right. I'm not one of you. And I'd rather raise my children to be honest and kind and ordinary than raise them to be Brennans." I looked at my husband. "Patrick, I'll be in the car. You can join me or you can stay, but I'm done being ashamed of where I come from." And I walked out of that tent with my head up, through the white roses and the crystal and 200 faces frozen in shock, out into the cool night air. I made it all the way to the car before my hands started to shake. Patrick came after me. I half expected him not to, and I'd already made my peace with that. But he came running across the lawn in his good suit, and when he reached the car, he didn't get in. He just stood there in the gravel and looked at me through the open door and said, "I'm so sorry. For all of it. For every time I asked you to swallow it." He was crying. "You should have walked out on this family years ago. On me." "I didn't want to walk out on you," I said. "I just wanted you to stand up." "I'm standing up now," he said. We drove home in silence, and it was the first honest silence we'd had in years. The aftermath was uglier and longer than the night itself, the way these things always are. There were lawyers. Russell tried to keep it quiet for the sake of the family name, but it was far too late for that. Half the party had it on video before I'd even reached the parking lot. The secret daughter, it turned out, was a perfectly nice young woman named Audra who'd spent her whole life knowing she had a father who'd never claim her, and who didn't want money so much as she wanted to be acknowledged as a human being. I'm told she got a lawyer of her own. The trust Gideon had built to punish my children collapsed under the weight of what he'd done to it. You cannot, it turns out, write yourself stern clauses about family values while you're embezzling from the very fund those clauses protect. Olivia and Sam's inheritance, such as it was, ended up safer than it had ever been under his control. But honestly, by then I'd stopped caring about the money. The money had never been the point. Gideon never apologized. Men like him don't. He moved out of the estate within the year, sold it, actually, to settle the legal fallout. And the last I heard, he was living alone in a condo, not unlike the one he'd kept Celeste in for 2 decades, abandoned by the bloodline he'd worshipped, surrounded by the ruins of a legacy that had only ever been a story he told himself about how much better he was than everyone else. Patrick and I are still married. It's been 3 years now, and I won't pretend it was simple. We went to counseling. We had hard conversations about the 20 years he'd spent letting his father wound me rather than risk the discomfort of choosing a side. But he chose, finally, and he kept choosing. And a marriage that survives the truth is stronger than one built on what we'd agreed not to say. A few months after the party, I drove out to Margaret's grave. I hadn't been since the funeral. I brought her the kind of cheap grocery store flowers she'd have pretended to find charming, and I sat on the grass beside her headstone, and I told her it was done. I told her I'd been brave enough to do the thing she couldn't, and I told her thank you for trusting me, for seeing me, for knowing across 20 years of frozen dinners that the nurse from Toledo was the only one in that family she could count on to tell the truth. I think about that box sometimes, about how she carried that secret for over a decade in silence, smiling, surviving, waiting for someone with more courage than she felt she had. I used to think courage was a thing you either had or you didn't. Now I know it's just the willingness to finally stop swallowing what's killing you. I was never one of them. Gideon was right about that. The way a broken clock is right twice a day. But I was someone Margaret trusted, someone my children could be proud of, someone who, after 20 years of being made small, finally stood up to her full height in a tent full of people and refused to disappear. That turned out to be worth more than any name, any fortune, any place at their table. I built a life that was mine, with people who chose me back, and the woman who walked out of that party into the cool dark, hands shaking, head high, free at last of a family that had never wanted her, was the truest version of myself I'd ever been. For 20 years, I believed that keeping the peace was the same as keeping my dignity. It wasn't. Every time I let Gideon slide an insult across the dinner table and said nothing, every time I tucked away that $40,000 envelope and protected Patrick from the truth of his own father, I told myself I was being the bigger person. I wasn't being bigger. I was disappearing, one swallowed comment at a time, until my own daughter sat crying in our driveway because the silence I'd modeled had taught everyone that I could be wounded without consequence. What I learned, sitting on that cold bathroom tile with Margaret's box open in my lap, is that staying quiet to keep someone else comfortable is not kindness. Real decency isn't the absence of conflict. It's the willingness to do the harder, honest thing even when it costs you. Margaret knew that. She carried the truth for over a decade because she didn't feel strong enough to use it, and she left it to me because she trusted that I would. The difference between us wasn't that I was braver by nature. It's that I finally understood that protecting cruel people from the truth only makes you complicit in their cruelty. I think a lot now about how the ending of the story was written years before that party. Cause and effect. Gideon spent 15 years stealing from the very family he claimed to be guarding, and the machine he built to disinherit my children couldn't survive its own foundation being rotten. You cannot preach about bloodlines while you betray your own. The collapse wasn't my revenge. It was simply the weight of his choices finally arriving. I only opened the door and let the truth walk through it. If I could tell my younger self anything, it would be this. Use your head before your heart in the moments that matter. I didn't burst into that party and start shouting. I made copies. I found my own attorney, not the family's. I had every document verified so that when I finally spoke, no one could call me a liar or a hysterical woman. Anger feels powerful, but it's preparation that actually wins. Feel everything, then think clearly, then act. And when you do act, expect it to cost you something and do it anyway. My hands were shaking before I ever reached the car. Courage was never the absence of that fear. It was standing up to my full height inside it. The strength to keep going through the lawyers, the ugliness, the hard conversations with Patrick and counseling, none of that came from feeling fearless. It came from refusing to shrink one more inch. I am still the nurse from Toledo. I always will be. But I am also the woman who stopped asking permission to exist. If you are reading this and there is a table you keep making yourself small at, hear me. Your worth was never theirs to grant. Stand up. Tell the truth. The shaking passes. The dignity stays.